Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight, we've some of the most disturbing true crime cases from around the world. Encounters that prove the real danger is always lurking somewhere. It's not hiding in the dark. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's step into true crime cases together. Kevin A. Schmidt. It was a quiet Saturday morning in Sycamore, Illinois. The kind of town where people still wave from their front porches, and crime feels like something that happens somewhere else. But on that day in early 2025, the silence was broken by the sound of sirens and disbelief. Inside a modest suburban home, police discovered the lifeless bodies of Holly and Gary Schmidt, a couple who had spent decades building a life, raising a family, and doing everything right. Both were found brutally murdered. The suspect, their own son, 35-year-old Kevin Schmidt. The neighbors would later describe him as odd, quiet, but not dangerous. They'd seen him mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, and exchanging polite nods. No one could have guessed what darkness was brewing behind those drawn curtains. But the truth is, the warning signs had been there for years. Court records revealed a tangled web of family tension, protective orders, and accusations that hinted at something far darker than domestic discord. A brewing storm of resentment, paranoia, and rage. Kevin had lived most of his adult life in his parents' shadow. He bounced between jobs, struggled with relationships, and often blamed others for his failures. His parents, Holly and Gary, had tried to help him, financially, emotionally, even legally. But love has limits. In the months before their deaths, a protective order had been filed against Kevin after a series of violent outbursts. When that order expired, so did any illusion of safety the couple might have had. Friends recall Holly saying she just wanted peace, that maybe her son had changed. But what she didn't know was that Kevin had been planning something final. Investigators later pieced together a disturbing timeline. Kevin had returned to the family home days before the murders, insisting he wanted to talk, to make things right. But what he brought instead was a chilling mix of vengeance and calculation. Inside the house, police found evidence of a struggle, signs that both parents had fought desperately for their lives. Yet, there was no sign of forced entry, no robbery, no strangers, just family and betrayal. The confession came fast. When officers brought Kevin in for questioning, he didn't fight. He didn't deny. He spoke calmly, almost detached, as if the reality of what he'd done hadn't caught up to him yet. "They never listened," he said, according to reports. "They treated me like a problem." It was less a confession of guilt than a justification of pain, a twisted attempt to rewrite the story of his own failure into one of control. But nothing about this was control. It was chaos masquerading as reason. Authorities described the crime as planned and deliberate. There was no moment of passion, no sudden snap. Kevin had waited for the perfect time. After the order expired, after the neighbors stopped checking in, after his parents had let their guard down. When it finally happened, it was fast, brutal, and merciless. The small town of Sycamore recoiled in horror. This wasn't just another tragedy. It was the destruction of a family from the inside out. People who had known the Schmidts for years gathered outside the home, laying flowers on the lawn, whispering prayers they didn't really believe would help. Reporters called it an act of pure evil, and for once, the phrase didn't feel like exaggeration. Kevin was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. He showed little emotion in court, no tears, no remorse. His face, pale and still, was unreadable, the kind of blank that unsettles you more than any display of anger ever could. Prosecutors described a man consumed by control, driven by resentment, and coldly capable of killing the two people who gave him life. His defense team suggested mental instability, untreated rage, the echoes of long-buried trauma. But even if all that were true, it didn't bring back Holly and Gary. It didn't explain why he didn't just walk away, why he didn't ask for help, why the only peace he could imagine was silence. Lawrence Krauss, in Albany, New York. The story began not with a 911 call, but with a confession. A man, calm and articulate, sat in front of a television camera and told the world that he had killed his parents 8 years earlier. His name was Lawrence Krauss, and in that one interview, he shattered the thin barrier between guilt and madness. He was 53 years old when the confession aired. Viewers at first thought it was a hoax, some deranged performance for attention. But the details he gave were too precise, too chilling. He spoke of the night in 2017 when he ended the lives of Franz and Theresia Krauss, his elderly parents who had grown frail and dependent. He said he did it out of mercy, to set them free from suffering. But what sounded like compassion quickly curdled into something darker. Because mercy doesn't involve hiding bodies. Mercy doesn't include continuing to collect their benefits for years after they were dead. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear this was not an act of love. It was deception layered over death. Lorenz had buried his parents in secret, covering up their disappearance by claiming they were living quietly in seclusion. For nearly a decade, he lived in the same house where he had killed them, surrounded by the memories and the evidence of what he'd done. To neighbors, he was eccentric, even strange, but never dangerous. He spoke about politics, about media control, about the failures of modern society. What he didn't speak about were the two people who had brought him into the world. When authorities dug deeper, the truth was as grotesque as it was surreal. The so-called mercy killings were methodical. He had planned them, executed them, and then moved on as though nothing had happened. Prosecutors later revealed that Lawrence continued to withdraw money from his parents' accounts, living off their pensions and benefits long after their deaths. The motive suddenly wasn't mercy. It was control, greed, and delusion. But what made Lorenz's case so haunting wasn't just the crime itself. It was the way he spoke about it. In his televised confession, his tone was calm, reflective, almost philosophical. He described life and death as if they were concepts in a debate, not the brutal realities of human existence. They were suffering, he said. I gave them peace. The words were hollow, but his conviction was terrifying. It was as if he believed himself the hand of mercy, blind to the horror of what he'd done. When police finally arrived to search the property, they uncovered what was left of Franz and Theresia. Bones, remnants, traces of a family erased and buried beneath lies. The house was a mausoleum of denial. Untouched rooms, old photographs, a life frozen in 2017. For years, no one had asked questions. The neighbors assumed the elderly couple had moved away. No missing person reports, no suspicions. Just absence, invisible, undisturbed, until the killer himself broke the silence. The public was fascinated, horrified, and confused. Who kills their parents and hides it for years, only to confess on national television? Some called it guilt. Others thought it was pride. A man too self-absorbed to keep his secret any longer. Either way, Lawrence Krauss had crossed a line few ever dare to approach. His mind, shaped by obsession and ego, had rewritten morality into something unrecognizable. When he was indicted on multiple charges, including murder and fraud, he pleaded not guilty, not because he denied killing them, but because he didn't see it as a crime. He told investigators that society wouldn't understand, that mercy looks like murder only to those still asleep. The arrogance was staggering. A man who saw himself as enlightened while standing atop the graves of his own family. Trevor Lee Middleburg, Florida. A quiet town where nothing truly terrible ever happens. Or at least, that's what people believed. But in August 2025, the illusion shattered. A 14-year-old boy named Trevor Lee stood at the center of a nightmare too brutal for anyone to comprehend. He was barely a teenager, still in middle school, still learning how to live. Yet what he did that night would mark him forever, as something far darker than anyone around him could have imagined. The story begins inside a modest home on a humid summer evening. David Lee, 44, and Brandy Smith, 45, were the kind of parents who worked hard, who tried to raise their only son right. There had been arguments, yes. Lately, more than usual. Friends said the family seemed tense, that Trevor had been acting distant. But in households across America, those small ruptures are common. Most end with silence or tears or grounding. This one ended in blood. No one knows what the final argument was about. The only witnesses are gone. But sometime that evening, Trevor went to his room, retrieved a gun, and returned to face his parents. The gunshots echoed through the walls of that small Florida house, tearing through the kind of peace that never returns. Both David and Brandy were dead within moments. The boy, who should have been asleep in his bed, had killed the two people who gave him life. When the police pieced together what came next, it was even more surreal. After the killings, Trevor didn't run. He didn't try to hide the evidence or flee into the night. Instead, he walked calmly down the street, to a church. Alone, blood on his hands, he stepped into a sacred place and called 911. His voice, trembling but clear, told the dispatcher something chilling. "Pray for me." He said he was waiting for them, sitting inside the church, ready to turn himself in. It was the call of a child who understood what he'd done, and also didn't. When deputies arrived, Trevor was there, waiting quietly, not crying, not hysterical, just waiting. The sight stunned them. A boy, 14 years old, hands cuffed in a church, accused of murdering both his parents in cold blood. The silence of that sanctuary became unbearable. Even the officers later admitted they'd never seen anything like it. Investigators described the case as domestic in nature. The motive, they said, was still unclear, but people close to the family began to whisper. There had been pressure, conflict, maybe even fear. Trevor was said to be withdrawn, angry, and increasingly disconnected from reality. Some called it a typical teenage phase. Others sensed something deeper, something quietly dangerous. But no one expected this. How could they? As the details emerged, the public struggled to make sense of it. How does a 14-year-old reach the point of pulling a trigger on his own parents? What happens inside a young mind that turns the people who nurtured you into targets? Psychologists would later describe cases like Trevor's as familicide born of adolescent collapse, a psychological break under pressure, often mixed with impulsive rage and isolation. But all the science in the world couldn't explain the raw horror of that night. In the days that followed, Middleburg changed. The family home became a crime scene. Flowers and candles appeared on the front lawn, placed by neighbors who couldn't look each other in the eye. Inside the courtroom, Trevor appeared in shackles, his face hidden behind long hair and oversized clothes. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The state debated whether to try him as an adult. Some said he was too young to understand the magnitude of his actions. Others believed age didn't matter when the act was this deliberate, this final. Prosecutors described a boy who had made a conscious choice, a deliberate decision to kill, not a sudden outburst. But defense attorneys hinted at a fractured family dynamic, emotional neglect, and possible abuse. There was talk of counseling sessions that never happened, of calls for help ignored. Somewhere between the two narratives, the cold-blooded killer and the broken child, lay the truth, buried beneath grief and confusion. Trevor's 911 call became a haunting centerpiece of the story. "Pray for me." Those 3 words echoed through every courtroom discussion, every news broadcast, every conversation about what drives a child to destroy his own home. Was it guilt, remorse, or simply fear? No one could say for sure. What was certain was that something inside him had snapped, and there was no undoing it. Nicholas Kirchner. When Georgia police stopped the car that June night in 2025, they thought it was a routine traffic stop. The man behind the wheel was calm, polite, cooperative. His name was Nicholas Kirchner. But before the officers could even ask for his license, he said something that froze them in place. "You're looking for me. I already killed 2 people." The confession rolled off his tongue as if it were a fact, not a crime. Within minutes, what began as a traffic stop turned into the unraveling of one of the year's most disturbing parricide cases. Authorities soon learned that the 2 people Kirchner was referring to were his own parents. He had been wanted by Florida law enforcement. But until that night, he had slipped away, driven hundreds of miles, leaving behind a house soaked in silence and horror. When officers pressed him for details, he described the killings as a righteous act. He said his parents had to go. He didn't weep. He didn't beg for understanding. He simply justified. It was the kind of language investigators would later call extremist, delusional, and apocalyptic. Neighbors back in Largo, Florida, described the family as private, polite, almost invisible. Nicholas was quiet but intense, a man who spent most of his time online, consumed by conspiracy theories and fringe ideologies. His worldview had been shifting for years, sliding deeper into fanaticism. He spoke about purity, divine justice, the cleansing of evil. When the police searched his residence, they found journals and online posts filled with cryptic writings, mixing religion, politics, and hate into something incoherent yet disturbingly certain. To him, killing wasn't murder. It was mission. His words, righteous kill, would haunt investigators and reporters alike. What righteousness could possibly justify the slaughter of one's own blood? As prosecutors later said, he didn't kill in anger, he killed in belief. And belief, when twisted, is a far deadlier weapon than rage. The timeline of the murders was grim. Evidence suggested Nicholas had attacked his parents in their Florida home, carrying out a deliberate and premeditated act. The scene told a story of control and conviction, not chaos. He didn't flee immediately. He stayed long enough to make sure they were dead. Then, calmly, he packed, left, and began his drive north toward Georgia. It wasn't panic that fueled him. It was completion, the kind of cold assurance that only true fanaticism breeds. For days, Florida authorities searched for him, uncertain whether he'd strike again. When his arrest finally came, his demeanor was chilling. The dashcam footage showed no emotion, no struggle, just a man talking about death as if he'd done something noble. They didn't understand, he reportedly told investigators later. They were corrupted. It was justice. But there was no justice, only slaughter. Behind the rhetoric and delusion was a man who had destroyed the only people who ever loved him. His parents' names were withheld from most reports, a final act of dignity for the victims who couldn't defend themselves. Their deaths were brutal and senseless. Their killer believed he'd done them a favor. Prosecutors quickly charged Kirchner with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. As more evidence came to light, it painted a picture of a man detached from reality, living in a self-made echo chamber of ideology and fantasy. He believed he was chosen, that he saw truths others couldn't. Investigators suspect he may have been planning further violence. If they hadn't stopped him that night, he might never have been caught. James Scott Grigory. The heat in rural Texas carries a silence of its own, heavy, dry, and unforgiving. In the small community of Normandy, that silence was broken one afternoon in 2025 by gunfire that would echo far beyond the ranch roads and fields. The man at the center of it all was 38-year-old James Scott Grigory, a son who turned his family's love into a crime scene spread across 2 homes, 2 lives, and 1 blood-soaked ending. Neighbors knew James as distant, unpredictable, but not evil. He was the type who kept to himself, lived on the edge of small-town life. Not quite in it, but not quite out of it either. He'd been struggling, they said. Mental health, money, isolation. The kind of slow decline that everyone notices but no one talks about until it's too late. And on a summer day in 2025, all those silent cracks finally split wide open. It began at his mother's house. She had tried, like mothers do, to help him. Maybe she offered advice he didn't want to hear. Maybe she reminded him of everything he had failed to become. Whatever the spark, it ignited something far more explosive than words. Without warning, James raised a gun and shot her. The woman who had carried him, loved him, and believed, even now, that he could still be saved. The moment was over in seconds, but its shadow stretched into eternity. After that, James didn't flee. He didn't call for help. He drove to another home, his father's. Somewhere between the drive and the doorway, something inside him hardened. The reports say he killed his father next. 2 murders, 2 parents, 2 lives erased. But even that wasn't enough to silence the storm raging in him. He turned the gun on the family dogs, killing them too, as if trying to erase every last piece of his past. The sheriff's office would later say that by the time they arrived for a welfare check, the scene was already chaos. James was armed, unstable, and waiting. When deputies approached, he opened fire. One officer went down, shot but alive. The others scrambled for cover, their training battling against disbelief. This wasn't a criminal ambush. It was a massacre fueled by madness. The standoff was brief, but deadly. Moments later, another gunshot rang out. This time, self-inflicted. James Grigory died on the spot, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he'd destroyed. When investigators entered the homes, what they found was devastation in stages, a sequence of killings that followed a pattern of unraveling control. There was no note, no manifesto, no explanation, just blood, bodies, and silence. The Texas Rangers were brought in to investigate, but even they struggled to piece together a motive. The crime didn't fit any familiar mold. Not financial, not revenge, not self-defense. It felt more like a collapse, a sudden and total implosion of the human mind. The community of Normandy was stunned. In a town that barely made the map, everyone knows everyone. To lose 3 members of one family, and 2 officers nearly wounded in the process, was unthinkable. Friends described the Grigorys as good people, quiet, kind, never trouble. But behind the closed doors of small-town life, demons fester quietly. Neighbors said James had been off for weeks, distant, agitated, ranting about people turning against him. No one thought it would come to this. In death, James left behind more questions than answers. What drove him to destroy the only family he had? Was it rage, delusion, or a desperate act of control in a life spiraling out of it? Investigators may never know. Some said he was paranoid, convinced the world was conspiring against him. Others believed he was consumed by guilt long before the trigger was pulled. All that's left now are fragments. 2 homes soaked in tragedy, 2 families erased from their own story, and a single, haunting truth. Sometimes the monster doesn't come from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly inside someone you've loved all your life, until the day it decides love is the enemy. James Scott Grigory's rampage ended the way all tragedies do, not with justice, but with silence. His death closed the case, but not the wound he left behind. And in Normandy, the wind still carries whispers of that day. The gunfire, the screams, and the unbearable truth that no one saw it coming. Nikita Kasap. In Wisconsin, March of 2025, the story broke like something out of a dystopian nightmare. A 17-year-old boy, calm and methodical, accused of murdering his parents as part of an extremist plot. His name was Nikita Kasap. On paper, just another high school senior. In reality, a teenager consumed by obsession, ideology, and the fantasy of power. What began as a domestic crime quickly revealed itself as something far more terrifying. A calculated execution in the name of a twisted political mission. When investigators entered the Kasap home, they found a scene that felt less like a family tragedy and more like a manifesto brought to life. His parents were dead, executed with precision, their bodies hidden. But what disturbed authorities most wasn't just the crime, it was the reason. According to court filings, Nikita's motive wasn't anger or abuse, it was strategy. He wanted money, autonomy, and freedom to carry out what he described as a greater purpose. Federal agents would later describe it as an extremist assassination plot, a delusional plan fueled by online radicalization and the echo chambers of hate. The boy had been planning for months. He'd studied, written, and trained. In his journals, they found lists of names, coded language, and strange philosophical rants about cleansing corruption and starting anew. He saw himself as chosen, a liberator in a world too blind to see. His parents, in his mind, weren't victims. They were obstacles, barriers to a destiny that only he believed in. It's difficult to imagine the mindset of a teenager turning ideology into murder, But Nikita wasn't impulsive. He was deliberate. He had a goal, a structure, a sequence. First, he would eliminate his parents. Then, he would take their money, their identities, and use the resources to move forward with his plot. That level of premeditation stunned even seasoned investigators. He didn't act out of rage, one federal agent said. He acted out of belief, and that's what makes him dangerous. The killings themselves were cold and efficient. There were no signs of struggle, no cries for help. After the murders, Nikita went about concealing the evidence, hiding the bodies, and taking steps to cover his tracks. He even attempted to access financial accounts, forging documents to give himself control. When authorities caught up to him, he was calm, almost curious, as if being arrested was just another stage of his plan. The absence of remorse wasn't teenage bravado, it was conviction. In interviews, he spoke of ideology like a gospel, abstract, detached, and frighteningly confident. He didn't talk about love, loss, or family. He talked about systems, power, and revolution. To him, the murders weren't evil. They were necessary. He saw himself as part of a movement, though no movement ever claimed him. His reality existed only in the confines of his mind and the dark corners of the internet, where extremism festers unchecked. Psychologists who reviewed his case called it radicalization without community, a phenomenon where isolation breeds delusion. Nikita's parents likely had no idea how deep their son had gone. They might have noticed his withdrawal, the change in his tone, the quiet anger, but never enough to imagine what he was planning. Most parents wouldn't. He was their son, not a threat, not a killer, until the night he decided he was both. When the story broke, it shocked the nation, not just because of the brutality, but because of what it represented: the merging of youthful idealism and digital extremism, the corrosion of empathy by ideology. Nikita's crime wasn't just murder. It was a glimpse into the new shape of evil. Calculated, detached, ideological, and disturbingly young. The aftermath left more fear than closure. Federal authorities stepped in, investigating links to online extremist communities and encrypted communications. They wanted to know whether Nikita acted alone or whether someone had pushed him toward the edge. But regardless of what they found, the damage was done. 2 parents gone, a child turned killer, a family line cut off by belief masquerading as purpose. People who saw him in custody said he didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a kid, thin, pale, almost fragile. But his words carried the weight of fanaticism. "I had to," he reportedly told investigators. "They wouldn't let me finish what I started." It was the kind of statement that lingers in your mind long after you've heard it, not because of its violence, but because of its conviction. Today, the case is still active, wrapped in secrecy and federal oversight. But even without a verdict, one thing is certain: Nikita Kasap represents a chilling evolution of horror, not born of rage, but of ideology, not fueled by hate of others, but by belief so warped it turned inward. And somewhere in Wisconsin, there's a quiet suburban home that once held a family, now empty. Another monument to a world where belief, unmoored from empathy, turns sons into executioners. Adlai, or Adlai's, Mestre. It began just after midnight in the quiet hills of Tijeras, New Mexico, a place where the wind moves through the pines like whispers of old stories, and the mountains stand guard over the stillness of family homes. But on that October night in 2024, inside one of those homes, something unspeakable unfolded. A young man named Adlai Mestre, just 24 years old, turned that stillness into a scene of unimaginable horror. Deputies would later call it one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever seen. A home soaked in blood, a trail leading to the edge of a ravine, and a son who claimed he didn't even know why he did it. When authorities first received the welfare call, they expected a domestic disturbance. Tijeras wasn't the kind of place where families vanished overnight, but as they approached the small residence tucked against the canyon, they noticed something immediately wrong. Drag marks in the dirt, a foul smell lingering in the cold mountain air, and a shovel half buried near the back porch. Inside, the house was silent, except for the buzzing of a refrigerator and the wind whistling through a cracked window. What they discovered inside would stay with them forever. The victims were Adlai's parents, Raimundo Mestre, 46, and Berta Huerta Conde, 51, both found in the main room, riddled with gunshot wounds. Nearby, the lifeless body of Brielle, Adlai's 17-year-old sister, lay face down, as though she had tried to run. Officers said the house showed signs of struggle: overturned chairs, a hammer on the kitchen counter, a knife near the hallway. A family photo, shattered on the floor, stared back at them, smiling faces frozen in time, unaware of what was coming. Adlai wasn't at the scene when they arrived, but the drag marks led them through the back of the property, down a narrow dirt path toward a ravine. There, beneath a layer of loose soil, they found what appeared to be an attempt to bury the bodies. The sheriff described it as a scene of chilling deliberation, as though Adlai had tried to erase the evidence of his own bloodline. Near the shallow grave lay a dead dog, the family pet. Even that creature, loyal and defenseless, had been silenced. When they finally located Adlai later that day, he appeared dazed, muttering inconsistencies, alternating between guilt and confusion. At one point, investigators said he claimed he didn't remember pulling the trigger. At another, he allegedly confessed, describing how voices had told him to end it. His statements changed with every interview, fragments of confession tangled with denial. What remained consistent, however, was the brutality of the act and the eerie composure he showed after it. Neighbors described the family as close-knit, quiet, hard-working. Raimundo was known as a steady man, who always waved on his way to work. Bertha volunteered at a local food pantry. Brielle was a high school senior, known for her bright personality and love for art. No one could reconcile the image of that family with the crime scene that deputies discovered. When the grand jury indicted Adlai in 2025, the community still couldn't process the why. There was no obvious motive, no financial gain, no history of abuse reported publicly. Some speculated a mental break. Others whispered of hidden family conflicts. Investigators noted his erratic behavior, his detachment from reality, and his unstable demeanor during court proceedings. Competency evaluations were ordered, an attempt to understand the mind behind such chaos. But perhaps what makes this case so haunting isn't just the violence. It's the silence that follows it. No manifesto, no clear reason. Just a quiet home turned into a tomb, and a son whose mind seemed lost in shadows. In the courtroom, as prosecutors recited the evidence, Adlai often looked blankly ahead, the same emptiness that deputies saw when they first found him. The sound of the gavel echoed, but it was that night's silence, the absence of screams, of life, that continued to echo long after. For the people of Tijeras, this wasn't just a murder. It was a shattering of trust in the sacred bond between parent and child, the kind of story that forces a town to look at itself and wonder how darkness like that can grow in the heart of someone raised among them. Diego Leyva. In Belen, New Mexico, just 2 months later, another tragedy struck, one that seemed almost too horrific to believe. Diego Leyva, only 17 years old, called 911 on a December night, his voice trembling, slurred, and drenched in confusion. "I did something bad," he said. "They're gone. My whole family's gone." When deputies arrived at the small home, they found the unimaginable. Diego's parents, Leonardo Leyva, 42, and Adriana Bencomo, 35, both shot to death. Near them lay their sons, Adrian, 16, and Alexander, 14, Diego's own brothers. 4 lives ended in one night, all by the hand of the family's eldest child. Authorities described the scene as pure devastation. Shell casings littered the hallway. The smell of gunpowder and spilled alcohol hung heavy in the air. Deputies said Diego appeared drunk, sitting in the living room when they entered, his face blank, his eyes glassy. When they asked what happened, he reportedly said, "I don't know. I just started shooting." The 911 call, later obtained by local reporters, revealed a chilling mixture of remorse and confusion. Diego wept uncontrollably, then moments later laughed, muttered nonsense, and asked the dispatcher to send someone to pray for him. Investigators believed he had been intoxicated during the killings, but alcohol alone couldn't explain the scale of his violence. This wasn't a single act of rage. It was a systematic execution of every person in the house. As deputies pieced together the timeline, they found no record of previous violence in the home, no known abuse, no warning signs that could explain why a teenage boy would wipe out his entire family. But neighbors told investigators they had heard shouting that night, voices rising and falling. Then silence, followed by gunshots echoing through the neighborhood. By the time police arrived, it was already too late. Diego was taken into custody without resistance. In the interrogation room, he appeared calm, detached. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "I don't know what came over me." Toxicology reports later confirmed high levels of alcohol in his system, but prosecutors suspected there was more to the story. A storm brewing long before that night. Classmates from his high school described Diego as quiet but distant, often angry at his parents for imposing rules he thought were unfair. Some said he'd been spiraling, drinking heavily, skipping classes, arguing with teachers. One friend claimed Diego once joked that he'd end it all one day. No one thought he meant it literally. After his arrest, Diego's face appeared across national headlines. The image of a teenager whose drunken confession shattered an entire bloodline. As he sat in juvenile detention, reporters questioned how a young man could harbor such darkness. Experts debated whether the act was the result of intoxication, mental illness, or a sudden psychotic break. The truth may never be fully known. The small town of Balin was left haunted by the aftermath. 4 coffins, 1 family. A home turned into a crime scene that neighbors couldn't bear to look at anymore. Local clergy held vigils. Candles lined the sidewalks, and people wept for children who would never grow up, and for the boy who destroyed them all. In court, Diego said little. He stared blankly as prosecutors described the carnage. There was no clear motive, no manifesto, no rage-fueled justification, just silence, and the cold echo of a night when something inside him broke beyond repair. Trinell Brown. The morning sun had barely touched the pine trees of Spanish Fort when the screams began. Sharp, desperate cries that shattered the fragile calm of a mobile home. Park tucked away from the highway. Inside one of those homes, a young father named Trinell Brown, just 25 years old, was holding an AR-15 rifle, and his parents were already dead. Deputies arrived to find a scene that defied reason. On one end of the living room lay Clemmy Brown, 52, his body still. Near the kitchen, Cyretta Brown, 42, was sprawled against the cabinets, lifeless. The couple's blood soaked into the carpet while, in the corner, a small child, Trinell's daughter, sat crying, too young to understand that her entire world had just fallen apart. It was March 18th, 2023, a date that would sear itself into Baldwin County's collective memory. Reports say the family had been arguing that morning. Neighbors later told investigators they heard raised voices, followed by the unmistakable rattle of automatic gunfire, a sound out of place in their quiet community. When deputies entered, Trinell didn't resist. He placed the rifle on the ground, lifted his hands, and said nothing. His eyes, witnesses said, were empty. No anger, no fear, just a hollow stare, as if he wasn't quite there anymore. Investigators pieced together the events in fragments. There had been tension in the home for months. Family arguments about money, about responsibility, about the way Trinell was raising his daughter. Court records hinted that the young father had struggled to hold steady work and often clashed with his parents over his lifestyle. Those arguments, however, had always ended the same way, in silence and uneasy truce, until that morning. The weapon, an AR-15 style rifle, was his. Authorities found multiple spent shell casings across the small home, a testament to the fury that had been unleashed within those walls. Deputies described the inside as a war zone. The refrigerator was pocked with bullet holes. A wall clock had stopped at 9:42 a.m. But what investigators couldn't find was a reason. Why kill the two people who raised you, in front of your own child? Why turn your home into a battlefield? Those questions haunted Spanish Fort for weeks. At the local church, the pastor spoke about evil, about how darkness can take root even in the hearts of those we love. Neighbors placed flowers near the trailer steps, and a child's toy, a small stuffed bear, was left by the doorway, where deputies had carried the young girl away. As the investigation unfolded, details painted a portrait of growing instability. Friends said Trinell had become paranoid, convinced people were turning against him. Some believed the killing stemmed from an argument over his daughter, that his parents had tried to intervene in how he was raising her, and he snapped. Whatever the trigger, the violence was over in seconds. 2 lives ended. 1 little girl orphaned. 1 man's soul seemingly consumed by something darker than rage. Thomas More. The Moore home stood near the water's edge in the sleepy town of New Point, Virginia. A white farmhouse framed by oak trees and the slow hum of cicadas. To anyone passing by, it looked peaceful, the kind of place where time moves gently and families grow old together. But on one humid June night in 2022, that illusion of peace shattered forever. When deputies entered the home, the first thing they noticed was the silence, that heavy, dreadful quiet that follows violence. Inside, Thomas More, just 24, was sitting on the floor, covered in blood. His parents, Adam and Melissa Moore, lay dead nearby. Both had been stabbed multiple times. The knife, the same one used in the killings, rested beside him. According to early reports, Thomas didn't run, didn't fight. He simply sat there and whispered, "It's done." No one could understand why. Adam Moore was described as a patient, kind man, the sort who fixed broken fences for neighbors without asking for anything in return. Melissa was known for her gentle nature, often baking pies for church events. Their son had been quiet, a bit withdrawn, but never violent. Neighbors said they had seen Thomas mowing the lawn the day before. Nothing unusual. But inside the home, investigators found signs of an argument that had spiraled out of control. A shattered photo frame, a chair knocked over, blood trails leading through the hallway. The official reports didn't detail what the argument was about. Some said money. Others said Thomas had been struggling with mental health issues, living in isolation, retreating further into himself. What no one foresaw was the explosion of violence that would end in tragedy. Autopsy findings later revealed that both parents had tried to fight back. Defensive wounds marked their hands and arms, suggesting they had begged their son to stop. But the attack continued until neither could move. The sheer savagery of it stunned even seasoned investigators. When deputies questioned Thomas, he was calm. Too calm. He told them he had to do it, but couldn't explain why. No drugs were found in his system. No evidence of outside influence. Just a mind fractured, perhaps beyond understanding. The Moore murders shook the small Virginia community. Matthews County wasn't accustomed to scenes like this. Not double homicides. Not parents slain by their own child. At the candlelight vigil held days later, townspeople stood in silence, clutching candles as the local pastor read the Lord's Prayer. Even those who didn't know the family felt the weight of it. A son killing his parents felt like a violation of something sacred, a tearing of the moral fabric that holds families and small towns together. As prosecutors laid out the evidence, they described the scene as a manifestation of bottled rage. But even they admitted the motive was elusive. Sometimes evil doesn't come wrapped in a clear explanation. Sometimes it's just a moment, one that begins with words, escalates with fury, and ends in blood. Thomas Moore was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In court, he rarely spoke. His expression was distant, as though he were watching his own trial from far away. There was no outburst, no remorse that anyone could see. When the judge read the charges aloud, he blinked but said nothing. Chandler Halderson. It began as a missing persons report, a young man calling police to say his parents had vanished after a weekend trip to their family cabin. On the surface, it sounded ordinary enough. A worried son reporting that Bart and Krista Halderson hadn't returned home. But within days, that story would collapse, piece by piece, revealing a crime so calculated, so grotesque, it would haunt Wisconsin forever. The man on the phone was Chandler Halderson, just 23 years old, soft-spoken and polite, the kind of young man neighbors described as quiet, respectful. But behind that calm exterior was a labyrinth of lies, and the growing pressure of being caught. For months, Chandler had been pretending to live a double life. To his parents, he was a successful college student studying renewable energy engineering, about to start a job with SpaceX. He told them stories of projects, grades, internships. He even forged emails, built fake documents, and created elaborate excuses when they asked to meet his professors or employers. But it was all fiction, every word. In reality, Chandler had dropped out of college. He was unemployed. And every lie he told dug him deeper into a corner he couldn't escape. By July of 2021, that corner began to close in. Bart, his father, had started to grow suspicious. He'd reached out to the supposed college to verify Chandler's degree. When no record was found, Bart confronted him. It was a confrontation that would turn deadly. Prosecutors believed that on July 1st, 2021, inside their quiet suburban home in Windsor, Wisconsin, Chandler shot his father in the back while he sat at the computer, perhaps moments after discovering the truth. Hours later, when Krista returned home, he shot her too. Then, in a chilling act of post-murder calculation, he dismembered their bodies and scattered the remains across the county. For the next 2 days, Chandler lived a lie within a lie. He told friends and family that his parents had gone to their cabin in northern Wisconsin. He even sent text messages from their phones, pretending they were still alive. "Made it safe," one message read. "Having a great time at the cabin." But the truth was far darker. When police began investigating, they noticed inconsistencies. Small at first, then glaring. Chandler claimed he didn't know the exact location of the cabin. He couldn't explain why his parents had left without telling anyone else. And then, investigators found something unexpected: a blood stain near the fireplace and broken glass on the floor. Forensic teams later discovered human tissue. Days later, the breakthrough came: a grim discovery on a rural property in Cottage Grove. Deputies found remains partially burned and hidden near a wooded creek bed. DNA tests confirmed what everyone had feared. They belonged to Bart Halderson. A few days after that, more remains were found, belonging to Krista. The dismemberment was methodical, cold, clinical. Investigators said Chandler had attempted to burn and dispose of the bodies using household tools: saws, a hatchet, even scissors. When confronted, he showed no emotion, no panic, no grief. He simply denied everything. The motive soon became clear: exposure. His entire life, the college degree, the high-paying job, the success story he'd sold to his parents, was a fabrication. Bart and Krista had begun uncovering his lies, and Chandler knew the truth would destroy the illusion he'd built. Instead of facing it, he decided to erase the witnesses, the two people who loved him most. The trial, held in 2022, captivated the nation. Chandler sat in court with a blank expression as prosecutors detailed the brutality of his actions. The jury heard about the fake emails he'd sent posing as university staff, the faked job offer, and the hours of internet searches on how to dispose of a body. They saw images from inside the Halderson home: the blood spatter, the cleaning supplies, the tools used to dismember. Every piece of evidence painted the picture of a man who killed not out of rage, but out of sheer selfish desperation. In her closing statement, the prosecutor described him as a man who built a tower of lies, then murdered to protect it. What struck observers most was his lack of emotion. Throughout the trial, Chandler rarely flinched. No tears, no visible remorse. He spoke softly, mechanically, even when describing how his parents went missing. To jurors, it felt rehearsed, a performance he'd been perfecting long before the murders. The verdict came swiftly: guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, 2 counts of mutilating a corpse, and multiple charges of providing false information to authorities. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. When the sentence was read, Chandler showed no reaction. But in the courtroom gallery, friends and family wept. One of Krista's friends spoke through tears. She loved him. She believed in him. And he destroyed her for it. In the aftermath, detectives admitted it was one of the most chilling cases they'd ever seen, not just because of the brutality, but because of the calm deceit that followed it. A son who murdered his parents, then calmly walked among neighbors, smiling, pretending everything was fine. Even now, people who knew the Haldersons struggle to comprehend it. They remember Bart's laughter at neighborhood barbecues, Krista's kindness, their pride in their son, a pride built on lies. They had believed in his potential, supported his dreams, and in the end, died for them. When investigators packed up the last of the evidence from the Windsor home, one item stood out, a framed family photo from years before. In it, Chandler stood between his parents, smiling. His father's hand rested on his shoulder. His mother's arm was wrapped around his waist. They looked proud, happy. That photograph, now a piece of evidence, captured a moment before the lies began, before the mask slipped, before love turned fatal. And that's the horror of Chandler Halderson's story. Not just the crime itself, but the slow, deliberate deceit that led to it. A son so consumed by the illusion of success that he chose murder over honesty. A young man who looked his parents in the eyes one final time and decided that his secret was worth more than their lives. In the end, Chandler's lies collapsed like the fragile structure they were, built on deceit, maintained through manipulation, and sealed in blood. The missing persons case that started with a calm phone call became a nationwide reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters don't hide in the dark. They smile from across the dinner table,